My name is Joni, and I'm the moderator for tonight. I facilitate Home on the Hill's Family Psychoeducational Support Group and provide mental health navigation and support work. It is my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker tonight, all the way from Victoria, BC. Lembi Buchanan is the leading advocate for Canadians living with mental illness to ensure that the government programs and policies do not discriminate against them. She has played a crucial role in reforming the Income Tax Act to broaden eligibility for disability tax credit to psychiatric disabilities and episodic disabilities and other types of disabilities. Her website, www.fightingforfairness.ca, provides a wealth of information about the application and appeal process to access the tax credit. Lembi has been starting to fight for fair tax treatment for her husband, Jim, who lives with bipolar disorder. They met when they were both graduated university in their late 20s, and they were living in New York. Lembi had just graduated as a social worker. I believe it was love at first sight. And Jim was diagnosed with bipolar 6 weeks after they met. They have been married for over 50 years and have 2 children and 5 grandchildren. Jim has been hospitalized over the years. She will discuss her life with Jim, her family, her advocacy work, reforming the disability tax credit, and her book entitled The Accidental Advocate. Lembi has received numerous awards for her advocacy work. She has been mentioned in a number of articles, which you can see on her website, by Marvin Ross from Huffington Post and publisher of the Bridgewater Cross Communications. David Goldblum, professor of University of Toronto of Psychiatry, wrote in her book. And I'm just going to read one of the comments that was. Sure. Marvin Ross said, the Canadian Revenue Agency has abducted its mandate for fairness and denying the disability tax credit to eligible Canadians with disabilities, and particularly those with psychiatric disabilities, according to advocate Lembi Buchanan of Victoria. Peter Goff from the Toronto Star said, there are many Canadians with serious mental illness who experts say are missing out on benefits and tax breaks because too few doctors understand what constitutes a disability. And without any other housekeeping and interaction, I'd like to introduce Lembi to everybody. Welcome, Lembi.
Thank you very much, Joni, and for your introduction. And I'll just take off from your last sentence. The problem with the CRA is that it doesn't view mental illness as disabling as many physical impairments. And that really is the crux of the problem. That was the problem almost 30 years ago when Jim was first applying for the DTC after a major setback, the manic episode and hospitalization. And that continues to be the problem to this day. And right now, the problem everyone's facing who has to reapply for the DTC or with new applications for the DTC, that the test for mental impairments is far harsher than the test for physical impairments. So the advocacy work, it just doesn't seem to end. Once we fix a few problems on one side, in one area, something else happens in the other areas. So it seems that I'd like to go back. I guess perhaps we'll start at the beginning and go back to a little bit about my bio. I was born in Sweden. My parents are Estonian. They both escaped during the Second World War, and we came to Canada when I was 4. And Jim and I separately married Americans. We were both from Toronto, and we moved to New York, and those marriages failed. So one Christmas in December 1972, we met at the LaGuardia airport waiting for our flight to take us home for Christmas, and there was a major snowstorm. So we ended up in the Greyhound bus for a 12-hour ride to get home to Toronto, and we've been pretty well. We've been together ever since. It was we were both crazy in love. The sky was the limit for me figuratively, but for Jim, apparently, realistically, I had no idea that he was climbing in this marvelous environment of everything being perfect and beautiful and great, and climbing higher and higher, and until he started exhibiting manic symptoms. And I wasn't familiar with mental illness, and there was a lot of irritability with Jim a few days prior to his manic episode. And so I didn't see anything coming. I was just a little sad that we didn't seem to sync as well as we did in the beginning of the relationship. And one morning, when I woke up in the morning, I just wanted to get up and out of bed and make coffee. And Jim was packing some things into a box, and he was just on top of me and started to beat me up for no reason at all. And I was screaming. He's the most gentle person that I know. And he was on a mission. Apparently he had been watching the snow on the televisions. That's what it was like back in 72 after 12 o'clock, and getting messages. And he was on a mission for God, and he was afraid I would stop him. And well, he stopped beating me. I said I'd stay in bed. I wouldn't get out of bed. And in any case, he ended up on the roof of St. Patrick's Cathedral later that day, waiting for a helicopter to take him to God. The police were waiting for him down below, and they took him to the hospital instead. I didn't know any of this at this point. I mean, he had just left the household, the apartment, early in the morning. And I had to have my locks changed because he had locked me into the apartment. And we had one of those locks that you need the key to get back out, because we had a garden apartment, and I was able to escape through the back garden. After the police left, because they had to come because I was changing the locks to the apartment, the phone rang, and it was for Mrs. Buchanan. Well, this was like less than 6 weeks into the relationship, but I knew Jim was always telling everybody he was going to marry me. So I thought somebody was just being cute, and turned out to be the ER department of one of the city hospitals. And I had to come and sign some forms so they could hospitalize Jim. And the police were waiting for me to arrive so they could leave. So when I got to the hospital, the gal at the ER, they were sitting in a corner, Jim in a chair. He had no shoes on. This was beginning of February. He had no shoes on. His jacket was missing. His pants were torn. And with two policemen sitting behind him. So I sat down beside him, and he gently touched my face, and he asked, "Does that hurt? What happened?" He could not remember that he had actually caused the bruises. And then he said, "Look how lucky I am. I've got my own Secret Service detail with me, so that the mafia can't get after me." In any case, I asked to use the phone because I was aware that Payne Whitney Psychiatric Clinic was a top-notch psychiatric facility. And I called them to see if we could transfer Jim from a public hospital, which I was, as a social worker, I was a little skeptical about their care. And the doctor that I spoke to said that unfortunately they didn't have any rooms at that time, but they really wanted to have Jim as a patient because he believed that Jim had manic depressive illness because of the manic episode. And they were doing clinical trials with lithium. Well, my goodness, how lucky could we get that lithium was just coming on stream. So arrangements were made for Jim to be transferred in 3 or 4 days. And I called Jim's father. And at that point, I heard that Jim had a history of mental illness. And Jim's father was on the flight from Toronto to New York the following day and helped me sort of hunt down things that Jim had lost, and the rental car and everything else that had been going on that particular day. So he was at Payne Whitney for about 6 weeks. But I was really torn at that time. I mean, I had just met Jim. Jim had moved in within a couple of weeks into my apartment. And I mean, we were soulmates. We had very different backgrounds as far as compatibility, but we had a lot of similar interests. But I was really torn about this guy who had beat me up, had been very violent. And sure, he was on medications and he was being treated, but what was my future going to be like? Like I wanted to have children. Like, would our children be stigmatized if with a father with mental illness? I mean, this was a huge fear because I really didn't know very much. I didn't know anything. Let's be honest. I really didn't know anything about bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, beyond having a couple of classmates at university who had quote unquote nervous breakdowns during exam time. So Jim's father, I mean, he was just such a wonderful man. And he was very clever too, because what we ended up doing was that Jim was going to go back to Toronto after he was released from the hospital for post-recovery. And because I wasn't prepared at that point for him to move back into my apartment. But Jim's father, and after another few weeks, arranged for a week in Myrtle Beach in South Carolina, so that Jim and I could spend a week together on the beach, with our motel was right on the beach. And Jim and his father drove down and they sent me tickets and I flew down and met them. And that gave me and Jim a week by ourselves without any pressures. And at that point, we realized that we really did belong together. I guess the proof is in the pudding. We're still together after 50 years, despite numerous challenges with Kathy, is obviously read about in my book. So that was the beginning of the relationship. We would have other setbacks and some very challenging ones. But more or less, we followed the science. And that saved Jim and it saved our marriage. So when I just want to fast track to 1990. We're living in Elliott Lake at this time in Northern Ontario. Jim is a community and relations officer doing public relations for one of the two mining companies there. And I was running a manufacturing plant, and we'd been living there for 9 years. I mean, we had a great life there. We had lots of friends. We were both very involved with volunteers, volunteered with various organizations. And it was 12,000, 15,000 people in the community. It was a close-knit community. And I had a really horrible cancer diagnosis. I had been feeling some pain in my lower abdomen, and I finally ended up getting an ultrasound, and I had several tumors growing from my ovaries. And I guess it's like anybody who's had a baby, when the baby starts growing in your abdomen, you're not in your uterus, you don't have any sensation of pain or anything else. But once one of the tumors became so big, it was impeding a nerve. So it was, I have this very rare form of uterine cancer. It's called endometrial stromal sarcoma, 1 in a million. And the prognosis was very grave at that time and they thought I had ovarian cancer because of the tumors. And my doctor in Elliott Lake was able to get a surgeon in Toronto to accept me a week later for surgery. Well, Jim, this devastated Jim, and he had another manic episode. And he had the manic episode when I was hospitalized. So when I was, he thought that he could cure me, and he took on the role of God. And this was the day before my surgery, and we're in my hospital room. And I realized right away, even though there weren't really too many signs and symptoms that he was becoming manic, looking back, there were certain irregularities, but who wouldn't be stressed out if your wife has a very grave prognosis? So it was clear that he was manic, and I rushed around. I found a resident doctor on the floor, and we managed to get Jim hospitalized. And so he was in the same hospital on the 8th floor, and I think I was on the 3rd floor. And in any case, when I was undergoing surgery, he was a patient of Dr. David Goldblum. So many of you might know him. He took a swipe at Dr. Goldblum, who's become a friend of ours over the years, but he took a swipe at him, and that was involuntary. That was putting him into involuntary status. So I didn't see my husband for almost 10 days after my surgery because he was locked up. And but Jim was very resourceful. He managed to he hired a lawyer, and he got out of his involuntary status. But fortunately, he was well enough to realize that he still needed hospital care. But after that was a huge setback, and he never recovered the way he had recovered from other setbacks. So then we started the process of applying for CPP disability and DTC disability, and also going after long-term disability benefits with Prudential Insurance Company. And that's where the advocacy work started. So Prudential, we did have a lawyer, and Jim did win, a tremendous settlement and long-term disability payments. But the CRA was different. The first time around, after 4 years of reviewing doctor's statements and files, they finally approved him up until 1995. But in 1996, he had to apply all over again. And the doctor was not happy with, the doctor didn't complete the form in his favor. So, and Jim was sure he was entitled, and I was already worn out from writing letters and getting in touch with our MPs. And the long and the short of it, Jim filed his own notice of appeal with the tax court. So when we got a letter about a hearing, stating a hearing was coming up, I knew that Jim would not be able to sort of represent himself in tax court, and we didn't have money for the lawyers. So I did my homework and read up on various tax court decisions, and represented him in tax court, and we won. And so certainly for people who read the book, I do copy from the tax court decision in terms of how and why the judge, Diane Campbell, made the decision that she did. So she recognized that Jim was not impaired in many areas, including Jim was driving a car and taking himself to his own medical appointments, but he was impaired enough in other areas that she allowed the tax credit. And CRA was not happy with the decision because they were afraid that it might open the floodgates, and they decided to ask for a review. And at that point, I could no longer represent Jim. A lawyer would have to represent him in the Federal Court of Appeal. But we were able to, CRA was responsible for our legal bills. So we hired the best we could find, since money was no object. So we hired the firm of Thorstensons, which is the largest tax law legal outfit in Canada. And we won that case. At this time, I was starting to advocate on behalf of others too, because obviously Jim was not alone in his trying to get the DTC. And obviously there are people out there, hundreds, thousands of people with mental illnesses or mental impairments. I mean, even intellectually challenged children and people with dementia who were not accessing the DTC. So I created a coalition for disability tax reform. And Carolyn Bennett was my MP at that time, and she sort of really, she was involved with the status of persons with this subcommittee for the status of persons with disabilities. And we had hearings, and so there was finally a committee was formed. I was involved with the committee, and we were able to make some major changes. And then that was 2005. So it was the first time that children with diabetes, this was another area. It wasn't just people with mental impairments being discriminated against. Back then, if you had a child with type 1 diabetes, if you could afford the pump, then you got the DTC for your child and then a child disability benefit. But if you couldn't afford the pump and had to do readings by pricking the child's finger and doing the injections, you didn't qualify for the DTC. I mean, how crazy was that? So we did get major reforms. And then we got Stephen Harper came into power, and things started changing again, and they started tightening up the screws. So a lot of the areas where we were able to have major achievements, they started tightening the screws, and especially in 2012, and it became more difficult again. So, you know, the book really is a catalog of going back to Ottawa over and over again. So anybody who's seen the cover of the photo, I actually did buy a pair of boxing gloves for $10, a used pair of Everlast boxing gloves. And I showed up at a meeting with them because I wasn't happy with the way when we were set up back in 2003 with a lot of money on the table. This was a very unusual committee, technical advisory committee. So we were already given the money to spend. It was just making how are we going to spend the money. And in terms of reforming the disability tax credit and broadening the eligibility criteria for a number of groups. So, but we also had on our committee people who were concerned about poverty amongst people with disabilities, and they'd been lobbying for years for money for poverty. So they were trying to steal my money, literally speaking. They were trying to redirect these funds that were already $65 million already on the table, which was a lot of money back in 2003. So I showed up with my boxing gloves, and we got back down to business, doing the work that we were mandated to do. So they have performed their function. So I was really, I was so pleased that the artist who did the watercolor artwork for the cover, that she really was able to capture the urgency that I always felt when I was showing up in Ottawa. So for those, and I'm swinging the boxing gloves in the other hand.
So it hasn't been an easy road, has it?
No, and it's hard looking back 50 years. I mean, 50 years is a long time, and we've had a lot of really good times, and the love has always been there. And I think the respect for each other. Jim is a very special person, and I guess we've been able to make it work, and doesn't mean that everybody else can make it work. And I'm really sad for how tough the life is, especially for parents with adult children with schizophrenia. Because Jim and I have had the good times also. Sure, it's been a roller coaster ride, but like I say, scary and wild, scary and exciting all at the same time. And I'm really, thank you for this opportunity to share my story. And I just hope that you read your book, not because it's a good read or that, but I really want people to start, exercising their voice with our members of parliament, because in my past experience, it's those letters to the individual members of parliament that have the greatest weight. that every individual, and when you go to my website and my last news alerts, there's a link to your MP if you don't know who your MP is. But those individual stories and experiences to their members of parliament. If one member of parliament gets 10 letters from about the same problem, you can be assured that they'll be looking into it.
And I just want to ask you, how do you get your book?
Okay, so don't go to Amazon, whatever you do, because they want to charge $37.50. I don't know why, but you can order it from any bookstore, any independent bookstore. Now, Chapters Indigo, they said they'd have it up within a couple of weeks. I don't know. My recommended list price is $24.95. But I find independent bookstores are charging anywhere from $26.50, maybe even as much as $29. But all bookstores have the information. It's distributed by Ingram, INGRAM. And I've gone to a lot of their websites. They don't have the image of the book up yet, but it's certainly available in the States also. I've had more orders in the States than Canada so far. The fight with CRA is a Canadian story, but it's a fight against government. I mean, it's the same story when you go to the US. It's just the players are different. And mostly it's about bipolar disorder. So yeah, it was a challenge stitching the two stories together. Into one memoir. I hope I did it successfully, Kathy.
Yeah, you did.
If Kathy says yes, I believe her. You are inspirational, and a lot of us are looking at, challenges with some of the mental health laws that regarding our families. It's a fight each and every day for us to get access to services, access to psychiatrists, and access to psychologists and CBT training. That there's so much that we need for our families, and it is a fight. So thank you, and maybe I will send many people your way to figure out how to advocate, and I will let them go to your page on how to go to your MP and how to advocate and some of the avenues that you went to. But I really thank you from the bottom of my heart. This was just an inspiring evening, and thank you very much.
When you send your letters to your MP, you don't have to put any postage on. And the other thing is, a handwritten letter is a lot more valuable than one that comes out of your printer. And if you have a photo of your child, put it in there, because this way the MP is forced to hold your son or your daughter or whoever in their hands. So it becomes a lot more personal.
Those are very good tips. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for attending tonight, and the people who are on the phone lines, thank you for attending.
So nice to meet you all.
And we will be in touch, and send us the information, and I will send everyone a follow-up from tonight.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.